Welcome to the Memory Scope channel. Be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss out more videos like this one.
A young schoolgirl, photographed amid the formality of a May Day demonstration in Lviv in 1968, stands as a quiet reminder that history's largest moments are always witnessed through the smallest eyes. By 1923, the man who had reshaped Russia could no longer speak. And this final photograph shows Lenin seated in a wheelchair, mute and paralyzed, flanked by his sister and his doctor, the revolution he built now continuing entirely without him. In the summer of 1939 at Nassau Point, New York, Albert Einstein sat beside his friend David Rothman, wearing the white sandals he had just purchased for $1.35 after his accented request for sandals had briefly baffled the shopkeeper. At 4:31 in the morning on June 22, 1941, an unauthorized photograph captured the precise moment Stalin learned that Germany had launched its invasion of the Soviet Union, an image the editor ordered destroyed but which survived regardless. 4 months after the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima, photographer Alfred Eisenstadt documented a mother and child amid the devastation. And the woman, when asked if she could be photographed, bowed deeply and posed with an expression he described as bewilderment, anguish, and resignation. Somewhere in the 1970s, children play on a neighborhood playground, their ordinary afternoon preserved in a photograph that now quietly holds the texture of a world that has since slipped out of reach. Among a group of young boys photographed in 1937, one small figure with a lollipop would grow up to become Fidel Castro, though nothing in this moment suggests what history had waiting for him. In 1918, in Luverne, Minnesota, German-American farmer John Meintz was tarred and feathered by his neighbors during the First World War, accused of failing to support war bond drives, his suffering a testament to how fear can turn a community against its own. In 1943, 21-year-old Sophie Scholl was convicted of high treason in Germany, after being caught distributing anti-war leaflets at the University of Munich alongside her brother Hans. And within days of her conviction, she was executed by guillotine. At a 1936 rally, one man, August Landmesser, stood with arms folded, while every hand around him rose in the Nazi salute, a man who had joined the party for work, but whose heart had quietly turned elsewhere after falling in love with a Jewish woman the state would not allow him to marry. On the streets of Istanbul in the 1960s, a man too drunk to walk was placed in a large basket and carried home by one of the city's basket men, workers who spent their days as porters and their nights ensuring no one had to sleep in the gutter. After what appears to have been a formidable snowball fight, Princeton sophomores gathered in 1893 to be photographed together, their disheveled, triumphant expressions a reminder that the rituals of youth change very little across the centuries. A photograph from Tennessee in 1937 shows 9-year-old Eunice Winstead beside her 22-year-old husband Charlie Johns, a marriage made possible only because the couple had falsified their ages on the application. The Reverend had accepted without question. A photographer named Per Ellis Edlund posed with his young daughter Tyra around 1910, and some 35 years later, the two were photographed again in the same spirit, the passage of time written gently across both their faces. The original Michelin Man, introduced in 1898, was white because rubber tires were naturally gray-white before carbon was added in 1912 to make them more durable. A company that also began reviewing restaurants to encourage longer drives and, in turn, faster tire wear. During the rush hours of the 1960s and 1970s, Tokyo subway pushers, formerly called passenger arrangement staff, compressed commuters into trains that by 1975 were reportedly packed to 221% of their designed capacity. In April 1985, a Royal Air Force tornado intercepted Concorde over the Irish Sea, long enough for photographer Adrian Meredith to capture the only known image of the aircraft flying at supersonic speed. A rendezvous that lasted just 4 minutes before the tornado's fuel ran out. During the liberation of Dachau in 1945, a photograph captured an emaciated 18-year-old Russian woman looking directly into the camera, her face a record of what the first German concentration camp, opened in 1933, had done to more than 200,000 people across 12 years. The Cincinnati Public Library, opened in 1874 and renowned for its soaring iron interior, was demolished in 1955 to make way for a more modern building nearby, and where its elegant reading rooms once stood, a parking lot now occupies the ground. In 1914, at Paris's Cochin Hospital, a patient undergoes a chest X-ray in the radiology department of Dr. Maxime Menard, a physician who would later lose a finger to the typhics of the very machine he used to peer inside his patients. In 1970s Los Angeles, an entire house was loaded onto a truck and moved down the street. A practical and quietly surreal act that captured something distinctly American about the relationship between permanence and the desire to begin somewhere new. By the 12th century, Bologna had raised nearly 180 towers across its skyline in a display of civic rivalry, and though almost all have since fallen, the tallest, standing 97 meters, still watches over the city today. On May 29, 1953, Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay became the first people in recorded history to stand at the summit of Mount Everest, a moment that belonged equally to both men and to every attempt that had come before them. In 1960, Senator and presidential candidate John F. Kennedy sat beside Milwaukee trailblazer Val Phillips, a woman already reshaping local and national politics, and turned quietly away from the camera as if the weight of what both their futures held was already present in the room. In Rome in 1944, amid the rubble and upheaval of a city just passing through war, an Italian woman paused to examine the kilt of a Scottish soldier near the Colosseum, a small human exchange across the gulf of language and culture. In 1935, a solitary figure stood on the earliest cables of the Golden Gate Bridge during its construction, the span stretching out beneath him above San Francisco Bay, the finished bridge still 2 years away from carrying its first crossing. A photograph taken in Bombay in 1958 shows a young Farrokh Bulsara, who would later take the stage name Freddie Mercury, before any of the fame that would eventually make his face one of the most recognizable in the world. General Patton, photographed after reprimanding his tankers for adding unauthorized weight to their Sherman tanks, stands with the stern authority of a commander for whom every detail of war was a matter of life and outcome. In 1945, Manhattan Project physicist Harold Agnew held the plutonium core of the Fat Man atomic bomb in his hands, an object that within days would detonate over Nagasaki and kill tens of thousands of people in a single moment. A 2,000-year-old glass mosaic discovered in the ancient city of Zugma in Turkey survives as a fragment of color and craft from a world that has otherwise entirely dissolved into the earth beneath our feet. At Balmoral Castle in 1896, Queen Victoria sat at the center of an extraordinary family gathering that included her son, the Prince of Wales, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, and the Tsarina Alexandra holding their infant daughter, the Grand Duchess Olga, a dynasty at its fullest before the century ahead dismantled it entirely. During the first half of the 1930 FA Cup final at Wembley Stadium, the German airship Graf Zeppelin drifted low over the crowd below, an almost impossible image of two worlds, sport and spectacle, briefly sharing the same sky. Built around 200 AD in Teotihuacan, Mexico, the Pyramid of the Sun rises from the valley floor as one of the largest structures of the ancient world, constructed by hands whose names and lives history has not preserved. Recovered from the wreck of the Spanish treasure ship Atocha, which sank in 1622, a gold bar bearing its original mint marks survived more than 3 centuries beneath the sea before surfacing again as a physical remnant of an empire built on extracted wealth. On the Sussex in 1875, a young Steven Spielberg stands in proximity to the mechanical shark that gave him more trouble than he had anticipated, a production that turned its difficulties into something that would permanently change how Hollywood made films. In the ruins of Berlin in 1945, a shattered German Stahlhelm lies in a puddle of water, with the gutted shell of the Reichstag visible behind it, the two objects together forming an unintentional monument to the end of a regime that had promised 1,000 years and lasted 12. In 1908 in San Francisco, a Victorian house was hauled along Steiner Street by horsepower, an entire home in motion through the city streets, relocated not destroyed, as if even buildings deserved the chance to begin again somewhere new. Found preserved in a well, this 2,000-year-old Roman shoe survived intact, while the empire that made it crumbled. A leather object that outlasted armies, emperors, and centuries of earth, pressing quietly down upon it. In 1925, photographer Henri Manuel documented a dinner party held in Paris for French soldiers who had suffered severe facial injuries during the First World War. Men who had survived the trenches only to carry the war's damage on their faces for the rest of their lives. Built in 1504 and standing for over 4 centuries, the oldest house in Hamburg was demolished in 1910. Its timbers and walls, a record of the city's earliest shape, cleared away to make room for whatever the new century thought it needed instead. In March 1918, near Luneville in France, soldiers of the 1st Battalion, 165th Infantry, worked from a dugout that served as the field telephone exchange. Their subterranean communications post a small but vital node in the vast and grinding machinery of the Western Front. On May 26, 1977, George Willig, known as the Human Fly, scaled the exterior of the South Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City, inching upward while crowds gathered far below to watch a man climb what most people only ever looked up at. On December 13, 1972, astronaut Harrison Schmitt of Apollo 17 stood on the lunar surface, examining a large boulder beside his rover, one of the last human beings to walk on the moon before the program that had taken him there came to a close. During the Prague Spring of 1968, a photograph captured the brief charged atmosphere of a Czechoslovakia, testing the edges of its own freedom, a moment of political openness that Soviet tanks would bring to an end before the year was finished. In the East End of London in the 1930s, Mary Smith earned 6 pence a week as a knocker-upper, rising before dawn to shoot dried peas at the windows of workers who needed waking, a profession born from a world that had not yet trusted the alarm clock. In 1934, a young Anne Frank was photographed on the beach, a child at the shore, with no knowledge of the diary she would one day write or the fate she would face before she was old enough to grow fully into the person she might have become. On July 22, 1944, Winston Churchill stood in the ruins of Caen, France, flanked by General Montgomery and Lieutenant General Dempsey, surveying a city that had been largely destroyed in the weeks of fighting that followed the Allied landings in Normandy. In a Chicago bakery, a 24-year-old Muhammad Ali spoke with 16-year-old Belinda Boyd, the two photographed together in an ordinary moment that preceded their marriage a year later in 1967, before either fully understood what their shared life would hold. On April 13, 1985, in Växjö, Sweden, 38-year-old Danuta Danielsson struck up marching neo-Nazi with her handbag, a single instinctive act by one woman against a column of men, captured in a photograph that has never lost its power to stop a viewer cold. From 1894 onwards, Otto Lilienthal flew his own glider designs, having proved through careful study of bird flight that curved wings were essential to the science of lift, making him the first person to demonstrate successfully that sustained human flight was not merely a dream but a solvable problem. A small stone grotesque sinks its teeth into a larger gargoyle on the roof of Salisbury Cathedral, a building whose main body rose over just 38 years between 1220 and 1258, and which remains one of the finest surviving examples of early English Gothic architecture. In Sweden in 1958, a 17-year-old Pele stood on the edge of a World Cup that would introduce him to the world, a teenager not yet fully formed, but already carrying something that the tournament ahead would make impossible to ignore. In 1896, photographers from the Detroit Photographic Company documented life aboard the USS Brooklyn, capturing not only the warship's armament and interior, but the quieter daily rhythms of the sailors who lived and worked within its steel walls. In 1896, a 15-year-old Pablo Picasso painted his first self-portrait, and when he painted his last at the age of 90 in 1972, some 50,000 works of art lay between those two images of the same restless, searching face. By 1980, a restaurant had opened at the top of the World Trade Center, offering diners a meal above one of the most recognizable skylines on Earth, in a building that still had 21 years left before the city below would lose it forever. In the summer of 1907, the racers of the New York to Paris Great Race lined up at Times Square, competing for a 1,400-pound trophy and the simple, enormous proof that an automobile could circle the world under its own power. In the 1870s, photographer Charles Marville captured a mature tree being transported on a wooden platform along the Boulevard Saint-Michel in Paris, a city already accustomed to grand gestures of urban transformation under Haussmann's redesign. A portrait from Scra, Algeria in 1870 preserves the face of a Moorish woman with a stillness and dignity that the camera of that era demanded from its subjects, and which time has since made feel like a gift passed quietly forward. In 1930, photographer Louis Hine climbed alongside the workers building the Empire State Building to document a cable worker at his post, capturing the human body suspended against the growing New York skyline with a matter-of-fact bravery that Hine never stopped finding worth recording. Windows 95 arrived not as a download but as a physical stack of 28 installation disks, a reminder of how recently the software that reshaped personal computing had to be carried home in a box, and fed into a machine one disc at a time. Beginning in the 1890s, Dutch Impressionist painter George Hendrik Breitner turned his camera onto the everyday streets of Amsterdam, and among his subjects was a lone cyclist on the Prinsengracht, an image as composed and attentive as any painting he ever made. In 1908, Lucy Smith and Pauline Rankin climbed the Salisbury Crags in Edinburgh as founding members of the Ladies' Scottish Climbing Club, a club formed that same year because women were formally barred from joining the men-only Scottish Mountaineering Club that already existed. Opera singer Aline Valandry was noted across late 19th and early 20th century Europe for her extraordinary hair, described as a golden mantle reaching to the very ground, a feature she tended for 3/4 of an hour each day, as though it were an instrument in its own right. In the 1970s, a child came face to face with Andre the Giant, and his reaction captured in the photograph said everything words would have struggled to express. The sheer physical scale of the man arriving all at once before the child's wide and astonished eyes. 1942, photographer Jack Delano followed George Camblair, an ordinary young American, through his transformation into a trained soldier, documenting even the unglamorous hours of kitchen duty that were as much a part of that education as anything done on a rifle range. In 1910s, photographer Walker Evans caught a Cuban man in a white suit moving through downtown Havana with an ease and self-possession that made him look as though the city had been arranged around him rather than the other way around. The HZ-1 Aerocycle was a mid-1950s American experiment in personal military flight that collapsed under the weight of its own ambition, as more thorough testing revealed the one-man helicopter was simply too difficult for untrained infantrymen to control, and 2 crashes ended the program entirely. Queen Victoria's close relationship with her Indian attendant Abdul Karim was considered scandalous by the royal court, and when she died, the same courtiers who had tolerated his presence evicted him from the home she had given him and sent him back to India. A young woman photographed at her spinning wheel in Ireland in 1905 sits in a domestic interior that speaks of continuity and quiet labor, a moment recorded just as that older way of life was beginning, though not yet knowing it, to recede. An ornate gorget crafted for King Francis I of France in the 1500s now rests in the Museu Militar de Lisboa in Lisbon, a decorated piece of royal armor that has outlasted the king who wore it by 5 centuries without losing any of its intricacy. An ice cream merchant photographed in Constantinople in 1898 stands with the quiet confidence of someone whose trade needs no explanation. A figure from the Ottoman Empire, preserved by the camera in the middle of an ordinary working afternoon that history would otherwise never have kept. The 1980 Citroën Karin concept car, designed by Trevor Fiore, arrived as a vision of the future so geometric and precise that it seemed to belong to a decade that had not quite yet decided what it wanted to look like. The Redic-O-Matic portable sauna became a consumer curiosity of the 1940s, sold on the promise that it could melt away fat, a belief that said as much about the era's hopes for easy transformation as it did about what people then understood of the human body. The World Fair of 1889 in Paris rose around the newly completed Eiffel Tower, a temporary exhibition that drew visitors from across the globe to a city that had staged spectacle before, but never quite at this scale or with this ambition. A Greek bronze Corinthian helmet, crafted somewhere between 525 and 475 BC during the Archaic period, preserves in its curve and eye holes the shape of a face that wore it more than 2,500 years ago and has since left no other trace. In 1987, Chernobyl plant director Viktor Brukhanov, deputy chief engineer Anatoly Dyatlov, and chief engineer Nikolai Fomin appeared in court to answer for the 1986 nuclear disaster. Three men photographed in the sober aftermath of a failure that had already changed the world around them. In the 1910s, New York City department stores invested heavily in window displays to draw holiday shoppers inside, and the photographs from those streets show a city already mastering the art of turning desire into commerce on the pavement of a crowded winter afternoon. In 1949, the arrival of a television set in a family home was still an event worth photographing, a moment when a piece of furniture changed the shape of the room around it, and, though no one could quite say how yet, the shape of everything else as well. Through the 1930s, thousands of families displaced by the Dust Bowl loaded what remained of their lives into old cars and trucks and drove west toward California, called Okies regardless of where they came from, following the crops and finding no fixed place to stop. Circus performers photographed in Germany in 1926 by August Sander carry themselves with the same quiet authority that Sander found in everyone he documented, people whose lives ran parallel to the ordinary world and who stared back at his camera without apology. In 1949, a couple lay on the banks of Tessen in Paris, photographed by Nat Farbman with the unhurried quality of a city that had survived the war and was remembering, slowly and with some relief, what it felt like simply to rest. The Maya sandstone Stela F at Quirigua in Guatemala, raised in 761 AD and standing 7.3 meters high, depicted the ruler Kak Tiluchan Yopat and was, at the moment of its erection, the tallest monument the Maya civilization had ever built. Train travel in the 1890s moved through a landscape still largely unaccustomed to the speed of rail, and the carriages and platforms of that decade preserved a formality of dress and posture that made even an ordinary journey feel like a considered occasion. At the 1927 Solvay Conference, 29 of the world's most extraordinary scientific minds gathered for a photograph, 17 of whom had already won or would go on to win the Nobel Prize, making the image one of the most remarkable group portraits in the history of human thought. A Spanish milkman posed with his donkey on a Seville street in 1910. The two of them standing together with the easy familiarity of working partners who had long since settled into the daily rhythm of the city's early morning rounds. In 1934, car manufacturer Tatra produced a brochure illustration explaining aerodynamics in simple visual terms, using the streamlined form of their T-77 model to make legible to any reader a principle of physics that engineers had only recently begun applying to the road. In 1904, a worker oiled the running gear of a Michigan Central Atlantic locomotive. A close and careful task performed amid steam and iron that kept the machinery of a continent's rail network moving one lubricated joint at a time. French street fashion of the 1910s carried forward the romantic softness of the decade before it, with puffy chests, small waists, long skirts, and an abundance of lace and pale color that framed the body in a language of delicacy that the coming war would quietly bring to an end. In Tokyo in 1935, soba noodle delivery men stacked towers of lacquered boxes on their shoulders and navigated the city's busy streets by bicycle, a feat of balance and spatial awareness that no written instruction could have fully prepared anyone to perform. On the 13th of May 1982, Hergé stood before a statue of Tintin and Snowy in Brussels, photographed in front of the characters that had made him one of the most widely read comic creators of the 20th century. The boy reporter in bronze and the man who invented him side by side. Around 1900 in Finnmark, Norway, Sami people were photographed in the northern landscape their culture had inhabited for generations. A portrait of a community whose way of life was already beginning to attract the documentation of outsiders who sensed it might not last.
तेरी तारीफों से रुकता नहीं, शाही लिखावट के हर पन्ने में तकदीर है, सहमा सा हूँ तुझ में, मानो तू ही मेरी तकदीर है क्या? चेक चेक प्यार बजे तू दिल की है पुकार मेरी तेरी यादों के सफर में कोई गुस्सा नहीं हो, दूरी तुझसे कितनी तेरी तारीफों से रुकता नहीं, शाही लिखावट के हर पन्ने में तकदीर है, सहमा सा हूँ तुझ में, मानो तू ही मेरी तकदीर है क्या?
कि मुझे सामने पाँव में हम खड़े हैं देखा के राहों में, ये दिल को आके फिर से तू भी थाम ले, हम भी हाथों में तेरे ही नामों के अभी जाम ले, कैसे बातों में तेरे रहे हिसाब, ये आंखों में रहे हैं तेरे